This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast number 141, Jocks, Part 1. I am Hal Hammonds, and I am a citizen of heaven and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for checking in this week. Last month, we discussed nerds. This month, we flipped the coin over. Sitting in with me are the biggest sports fans and occasional participants I could find. BJ Sipe preaches for the Church of Christ in Danville, Kentucky. He also hosts the Set Your Mind Above podcast. Terry and Peyton Francis co-host the Pork and Son podcast, focusing on sports in general, Tennessee football in particular. Terry also preaches for the Church of Christ in Chelsea, Alabama. Let's start with what I've been preaching. The phrase God-given talent is thrown around a lot, and in truth, all talent is God-given. But he blesses some more than others, and he never blessed anyone more than he blessed Samson. He rarely worked hard, he indulged his vices left and right, and God gift-wrapped one victory after another for him. I hate to say it out loud for fear of giving God an idea, but sometimes we have it too easy. Are we guilty of taking our blessings for granted? And is getting the job done the same thing as submitting to God? Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm gonna defer to the older and wiser of the preachers among us. So Terry, why don't you take it off?
By the way, Hal's older than me,
But not wiser.
Just want to throw that out. You know, I think so. I've coached a lot and I've watched a lot in my kids. There's three types of players. There's the extremely talented player. There's a player that works really hard, and then there's the extremely talented player that works really hard. And so and you can see sometimes one of BJ's boys from the Ducks we watched play in high school, Dylan Mitchell.
Oh yeah,
and he was one of those guys that had amazing talent. Little known fact about Mitchell, he was out of Memphis. His dad was once the fastest police officer in America. I don't even know what competition you for that, but his speed was genetically gifted to him. I mean, his dad was fast and Dylan was super, super fast. You could just see him run a post and outrun everybody on the team. And he had over 270 all-purpose yards against us in one game. Just phenomenal. And just put in context, for a guy to go play with a major D1 program like the Ducks out of Memphis, you got to be really, really, really good.
Yeah.
But Dylan wasn't just a fast kid that had this God-given talent. He was a kid that actually applied himself and ran great routes, was a two-way player, worked really hard. And from his coach at the time is now coaching at Peyton's old high school. Just a really good work ethic. Samson had the God-given talent. It wasn't really genetic, but the same kind of thing. But Samson just abused his power. He abused it for selfish reasons. When you think about it, it's a really bad story from that standpoint. And I think one of the lessons from Samson, obviously, is God can use you even when you're a really bad guy, but it's also a lesson in the loss and abuse of what could have been an even greater life than what we read about. I mean, can you imagine if Samson had applied himself? And so your ultimate question and all that, Samson's kind of illustration is, do we take our blessings for granted? I mean, absolutely. I mean, we do that every day. It's funny to ask this question 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, right? For a lot of us, the only time we'll really think about our blessings is when we eat turkey and dressing, which, by the way, is my favorite holiday. I'm a food guy, right? You can tell it by looking at me. So that's my favorite thing. Peyton knows that. I love it. I got an inflatable turkey in my yard. That's how much I like Thanksgiving, man. I'm all in.
Shout out Turkey Tom.
Yeah, Tom the turkey up there on the hill. But we should be a lot better at this. and not only being thankful, by the way, you read the story of the parable of the minas and the parable of the talents, and it's just frightening to me to look at all the things we've been blessed with. Sunday we was talking about in our lesson, how to make a better world, and I went to 1 Timothy chapter 6, as for the rich, talking about investing for a better future. And man, one of the things I told everybody in the auditorium was, there's not a poor person here today. Like, by the world standards, there's not a single poor person in our auditorium. And we read that 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19, and we see as for the rich, and we think that's some other guy that lives in some gated community up on the hill in a bigger house than me, or drives a nicer car. I'm not who he's talking about. Yeah, you are. And that's not a God-given talent in the sense of Samson's strength or Dylan Mitchell's speed that I talked about earlier, or something maybe you have, but it is God-given blessings, right? And there's a principle there that you take what God gives you and you use it to the glory of God and to the betterment of others, rather than just doing it for, Samson didn't do that. Samson did everything for himself. You look at every time he uses his strength until the very end, and we could debate what he does there, but everything up to that point is purely selfish intent. It's purely selfish intent. So yeah. Those are kind of my thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Terry, especially, his intent behind what he did. And it's amazing how God can use, even gifted people and gifted nations, and use them for his purpose, even if they're being selfish in origin. And we kind of see that, in Samson's life. It's interesting, the part of your question that really stuck out to me, Hal, was my mind drifted to a different biblical character that I'll address in a minute, other than Samson. And it was really this question that you asked of, is there a difference between getting the job done and submitting to God? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest things that was impressed upon me in my period of training, in my years of training to, enter ministry full time, I did a summer with Mike Wilson one time, and Mike was working me about 70 hours a week. I mean, it was insane. I was doing 2 sermons a week, 2 classes a week. I had to read a book a week and write a report on that book, the bulletin, visiting. It was an insane schedule. And one of the things that Mike really impressed upon me when we were going through that is he talked about, you have a natural ability to speak, and you're charismatic, you're extroverted. And one of the biggest temptations that you're going to have is to just wing it, or to not put in the work. You're going to have, this temptation to put things off, do things you'd rather do, and to kind of put things off and do the job in a way that it's going to get the job done, but you are not going to be able to accomplish what you could or grow as you should if you, were actually dedicated and submitted yourself and everything, to this. So the person I thought of when we were, as I was thinking about this and kind of working through this question, is actually Timothy. And I thought about 1 Timothy chapter 4. So obviously, Timothy is a gifted young man. Like, he's Paul's number 1 draft pick, right? And he tells the Philippians, I don't have anybody else like this guy. He's like, this is it. And Timothy had gifts that, were from the Holy Spirit, that were on him by Paul's, laying of hands on him. But Timothy didn't rely on that gift. In fact, Paul is going to encourage him not to neglect that gift. And I think this is really interesting. He kind of makes a differentiation between the gift and the work that Timothy needs to do in addition to the gift in 1 Timothy 4. So he says, command and teach these things, verse 11, let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Until I come, devote yourself to the public teaching or reading of Scripture, to exhortation, and to teaching. Do not neglect the gift you have, which has been given to you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you. Practice these things, immerse yourself in them, so that all may see your progress. And that's really the kicker for me. You see that, and Timothy could have just gotten the job done, and he probably would have gotten the job done, but he would not have grown. Others would not have seen his progress. He wasn't just to rely on this gift. Paul says, don't neglect this gift. And I think what he means by that is not just not exercising what, was in him, but not doing the work that he was called to do. And that's why, what you and Phil do, Terry, with, do the work, that's taken from his, Paul's language to Timothy, do the work of an evangelist. The work of an evangelist is not accomplished in the way that it should be with, selfish motivation or with laziness or any of these kinds of things. And so just from my perspective, coming from someone, who has devoted his life to the preaching of the gospel, that's where my mind went to with this, is how easy it is for guys to just rely on their natural abilities or their talent or what they've already studied, rather than growing and putting in the work to become better and make the kingdom better if they had.
Do you think there's a bit of a self-service involved in this? Terry had mentioned the minas. I always pronounce it minas. I don't know which one is. Terry's probably right.
In the South, I'm probably wrong.
Oh, well, I'm Texas representing here. But, the fellow with the 10, he does great. And what happens? Well, he gets the responsibility that the other fellow had not gotten. And Jesus says numerous times, to him who much is given, much is required. Every time we succeed in something, we set ourselves up for more opportunities for success, greater success, broader success, which can seem encouraging and it can seem kind of intimidating. And maybe we kind of subtly get in our head, if I just kind of hang in there, if I just show up every week, if I don't spike myself too often, then maybe I can get off easy and the Lord's not going to expect much out of me. Therefore, I don't have to expect much out of myself. You think there's some of that?
Go ahead, BJ.
Yeah, I was kind of putting my thoughts together. Why don't you go ahead, Terry? I still want to work on that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're humans and humans love the path of least resistance. Like, that's the way that we're a lot like water, right? We'll go the easiest path no matter what. So if you can mail it in and get by, yeah, sure. Everybody, let's not pretend that that's not how we are. I think one of the problems with that, by the way, is how we define success. Like, I think one of our failures in this is, I'm not so sure what we define as success is the way God's going to define success.
Right.
That's the scary part.
That's what I was trying to actually articulate there. So my father-in-law told me long time ago that when you're comfortable, you're never growing, but when you're growing, you're never comfortable. And what's interesting is oftentimes the things that we measure ourselves by, our worth, our success, those types of things, are we comfortable? Actually, that's how we measure success. Like, the people who are the most successful have the most comfortable home, have the most comfortable, work schedule, have the most comfortable, environment in which they surround themselves with. But that's when you open up the Bible, you see the most successful, workers of God and students of God. That's not the definition of their life. Comfort is not the definition that encompasses every area of their life. It's something far different. And I think that we've got to get it in our head that we get too comfortable, kind of like God's warning to Israel in Deuteronomy 8, forgetting that God is the one that brought them into this place, unless they think that they're the ones that brought themselves this far and did all these things. And I think once we do get comfortable, it's really easy for us to change what our goals are. We want to kind of pursue that and keep that, rather than seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness and pursue that wherever that leads. Because sometimes where that's going to lead is going to be very difficult, and it's going to require the gifts that God has given us, and God has put us in these positions to use those gifts to accomplish those hard things. But we neglect those often because we're focused on the wrong thing.
I think part of this is, what do you want out of out of life in general? Like, part of what you're talking about is, what do you want? Like, when you look at Samson, what he wanted was not what God wanted, right? Another flawed, like, you talking about another guy that's physically gifted that just doesn't step up. Saul, who, you know, looks like a king but can't act like one, and why not? He didn't want it at the end of the day. And, you know, the difference between this, when I've watched athletes, the difference between those who are gifted and those who are gifted and actually apply themselves, or even the ones that apply themselves and outwork the gifted kids, is they actually have the desire. They want it. They discipline their body to get what they want. This fuzzy-headed kid next to me, you know, when he was little, he was always the biggest kid on the team. And he was a starting offensive lineman in the 4th grade on the 6th grade team. He was huge. He gets to high school, you know, he's not as big. He gets hurt. And there was a time where he didn't want it. And one of the things that he did not get from me that he's still mad about is he's 4 inches shorter than me, which means, and BJ knew what this means, he's 5'11" and a half, which is the kiss of death if you ever want to get into college. Like that, if you could just, he could not, he tried bribing another half inch of the person measuring him.
I even grew hair out.
Yeah, everything he could do. But his coach calls me one time before his senior year. It's the spring of his junior year. And he says, "Do you know where your kid's at right now?" I was like, "No." And he says, "He's the only kid on the offensive line that has his own helmet." So he said, "I just watched him for 10 minutes hit the sled by himself, because nobody else has a helmet, but he does. He's already worked out. He's down there hitting the sled, and now he's carrying tires. And he's carrying tires, and he's been out here for 30 minutes, and he's not done yet." Well, what was the difference? The difference was, first off, he wasn't as physically gifted as he used to be. But the biggest difference was he wanted it finally.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, when it comes, there's a story there to apply to us. When it comes to spiritual stuff, you know why we don't apply ourselves and use our God-given talents to God's glory? Because we don't want it. That's not what's important. Like, we want other things.
Mm-hmm.
We want comfort of life and retirement and money and houses and toys, and we don't want the other stuff. And you know, a lot of us are a lot more like Samson than we want to believe. Truly, we're using the things God gave us to serve ourselves.
Well, let me get Peyton in on this a little bit, if he doesn't mind. He's here of his own free will. He can answer a question. You're considerably closer to your parents' house than the rest of us are.
He's still in my house. That's pretty close.
That's pretty close.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot of comparisons between our relationship with our earthly fathers and our relationship with our heavenly Father. Is my memory of serving in my father's house was, I want to stay out of trouble. I want to do what is expected, but not too much. I don't want to set myself up for some kind of reliability kind of thing. Mm-hmm. There's a real incentive to just kind of slide by a little bit. I don't want to pry into your relationship with your dad too much.
I feel like I need to leave the room for him to answer.
But can you relate a little bit, as a relatively younger person, this tendency that we oftentimes have to not really want to push, to not really want to excel?
Well, you know, a lot of people my age, when it comes to not wanting to push, not wanting to excel, about ballpark range, 45% of the time is because they don't know what they want to do in the future. Mm-hmm. As we all know, COVID happened. Before COVID hit, I was enrolled at Florida College, going to be getting my secondary education degree, teaching high school history, coaching football. That was a plan. COVID hit. Not only did it stop a lot of worldly plans, but it stopped plans in general for everybody. And gave us a lot of time to just really sit, be with the family and think. At this particular time, it was tough for me because this was also a transition where I was moving into back with my parents because I was, working locally and looking to maybe go to college there as well. And that was a weird transition, going to college, being by myself independently for 2 years, making my own decisions, and then coming back. And it was tough for me to kind of find a balance between following the rules and then which rules to kind of talk with the parents about and be like, okay, this is a little strict, I guess would be the word. I have the, laser focus being pointed on me right now. But so it was kind of difficult to find that, and living, for a year, not only did we I think we're better at finding, at least I am better at finding that balance of being somewhat of a independent adult while living at the parents' house still and going with their rules and doing everything they, every rule and regulation they've got set at the house. You got to follow it because, they've opened the doors to you again, especially in my case. And so I'm able to come back in. So out of respect to do that. Now also back to the not wanting, kids not knowing what they want to do. Like at, that quarantine lockdown time, I was kind of in that situation. And obviously we were at home a lot, and we have 2 grandparents at the house, who need, I guess, assistance every now and then. And so doing that with my grandparents kind of made me realize, hey, I'd be pretty good at this nursing thing. Like I'm, somewhat patient with them. I can motivate them to do that kind of thing. And so during lockdown, I was able to find out what, I wanted to do ultimately. And so thankfully, that's one of the big surprises, the pleasant surprises that come out of COVID and all that kind of ordeal, being locked down, spending time with the family, kind of figuring out question marks in your life for that thing.
That and watching all the Marvel movies in order. That was
that was fun. That was a lot of fun, a lot of binge watching. But also, besides that one, sometimes it's difficult for kids my age of disappointment and reaching expectations. Sometimes I find myself kind of lowering the bar, and kind of doing like what you said, the bare minimum, just for out of sheer, potential disappointment for other people that you're super close with. And whatever it may be, because of that reasoning, maybe anxiety, maybe you're not good with a specific talent. That's always tough. And sometimes you just gotta take a deep breath and get on with it, because ultimately, like those kind of things, it doesn't really matter about what other people's expectations are of you in that certain situation. What matters is, for a spiritual standpoint, like let's say I'm super nervous about leading singing and I get put on the duty roster for next month. I'm freaking out about it. And it doesn't matter if you sound good, if the pitch was correct, if you're doing the, I don't know what the official term is called, the beat motions or whatnot. All that matters is that if you're doing the correct things and giving praise to God, that's the only thing that matters in that certain situation. It doesn't matter about how you think the elders think that you did, or the deacons think that you did, or, Karen with the screaming infant in the nursery, how, what she thinks you did. All that matters is you pleasing God and ultimately giving that sacrifice to him. So it's hard to, focus on that aspect a lot of times in certain situations, but ultimately, like, I guess the long answer of saying it is, you got to remember who you're doing it for. Whether it's moving back in with your parents, you're following the rules because you're doing it for them. You're following the rules, most importantly, because you're doing it for God. Same thing in the church. there's a lot of things that needs to be done, especially for the male aspect, and also the female aspect with leading, Bible classes and certain things like that. But you're not doing it for anybody else. You're doing it for God. That's your purpose. That's your duty. You're doing it for God. So,
well, and as a parent, and BJ's got precious little kids at home, and certainly glad your son's feeling better. We've been through, I didn't reach out, but we've been through similar scares with our youngest. But how this, the hardest, your question here about if getting things done is the same as submitting, as a parent, it's really hard sometimes not to teach your kids that just because you did finally what I asked, that's not actually submission.
Mm-hmm.
And making that clear to them, I think that's a hard thing for me sometimes, as a parent, to kind of sit down, and we've had some of those talks about, hey, look, this isn't just about me. Like, you think this is just about me being disappointed and you disrespecting me, but ultimately this is about you and God. Like, your relationship's not what it should be with God. And if your relationship, and especially with Peyton being up 22 next month, one of the things I stress to him, especially at this point of being an adult, quote unquote, is the issues we have are almost always rooted in the fact that your relationship is not where it should be with God. Because if you were submitting to God fully in everything in your life, we'd be great. Now, that's not just true for Peyton, by the way. That's true for me. That's true for me with my wife, with the elders, with the people at church, with my neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the key to all those relationships, right? It's one of the things I love about Ephesians. It starts in 5 and then through 6. Every time Paul talks about relationship, the standard is Jesus, right? How do you fix a relationship? Jesus. That's how you fix a relationship. Get your relationship right with Jesus, and then your relationship with your mom and dad, with your kids, with your employees or your employer, with your neighbor. It'll be fine if you just fix your relationship with Jesus. So, I think that's a great question and a great thing to think about that you asked there, Hal. Is getting the job done the same as submitting? No. And by the way, we're raised that the end justifies the means. Like, that's part of the American culture. It's just not true.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not true.
I love what you said, Peyton, and following up on that, Paul asked the Galatians, am I trying to please men or trying to please God? If I were trying to please men, I still wouldn't be a servant of Christ. And going to how that details into what, Terry was just talking about, it is so much easier to get the job done in a way that deceives everybody to thinking that you're submitting and that you're an effectual worker. And, I don't know, maybe I'm just me, but, you hear the way that people talk about you sometimes, and they'll say good things or kind things or compliments, but I don't think those things, right? Because I know the real me. And that's the interesting, thing is, if pleasing people is what I'm trying to do, then you can just get the job done your whole life, but that will be exposed one day.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm trying to please God, then what I'm doing with my time, what I'm doing when no one else is watching, my integrity, everything else is different. And that's what moves someone to not just getting the job done, but really to submitting. In, I use this expression a lot, that Jesus is not Lord of your life unless he's Lord of all of your life.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. Jesus is not just, Lord of my time here, and here, or Lord of my budget here, and here, or Lord, he has to control everything.
mm-hmm.
And if I'm just getting the job done and trying to please others, and that's my motivation, and that's why I do the things I'm doing, to receive the praise of others, one, I'll get my reward right then. But then two, I'm just going to miss everything that God has prepared me for and wants me to do. And so I was just thinking about, what you were saying, Peyton. I think it really works really well and ties in well with what we're talking about, and goes down to the heart of the matter, the motivation. Why am I acting this way? Not just should we act this way, but why am I acting this way?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you bring up Paul. He's personally one of my favorite Bible characters. We were talking about Samson earlier in the question, and I consider Samson like a positive example of what we're talking about here, because, you know, growing up, Paul was born into, I guess you could call a higher class.
You said Samson, you meant Saul.
Saul,
Yeah,
sorry.
let's
Samson,
correct that.
Yeah, Saul.
Did not
Saul,
teach my kids Samson is positive. I want everybody to know that.
yes. No, Saul is, you know, born into a kind of a relatively higher Jewish class who they really not adore the Roman culture, but they abide by it. And he was one of, you know, especially at a younger age, he had the talent. Like Paul was one of the younger people to be on the council at his age. I mean, he was there with the stoning of Stephen, holding the coast. And that's kind of a big deal at that time. And Saul had all this talent, and he was using it, you know, for the council and, you know, enforcing the Roman law. And then all of a sudden that road to Damascus just changes just like that. A couple of days later, you know, it's a complete 180. And not only is he using his talents for God, but kind of like you said, and what he taught Timothy, like, you know, the only expectations he had was pleasing God.
Right.
And going into that.
You know, what's really interesting about that is, I think sometimes, you know, when Paul stands before the council, at one point, he says that I've always made it my aim to be pleasing, you know, to God, and they, you know, strike him, you know, in that instance, and
act in a good conscience.
To act in a good conscience before God. And I think sometimes, even because what you're getting into is absolutely correct, but I think sometimes we can think that we're trying to please God and not man, but really, as you're bringing out, like, there was a sudden change in Paul, and everything was backwards, and it was exposed. You know, in Philippians 3, he really brings that out, and all these things that he counts now as rubbish that he used to think were important in his pursuit of God. And so I think maybe that's even a bigger warning to us, is there are sometimes that we can think that we're doing it for God, but we need to, you know, realize that sometimes we could be deceiving ourselves. And I think Paul is a perfect, you know, example of that, as you're talking about.
Saul, that sign, you know, the sign that Saul goes blind and then he's allowed to see.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the change happens. And that blindness is really symbolic of his blindness by Judaism all the way up to that point to not accept Jesus. And now he accepts Jesus. It's kind of, that's where Saul's kind of apostleship is very similar to the way Mark presents the Gospels. In the middle of Mark, there's that healing of the blind man. And up to that point, the apostles seem to struggle. And then the healing of the blind man story. And not only does the blind man see who Jesus is, but the apostles start seeing who Jesus is. And there's this really cool kind of symbolic thing there. Same thing with Saul, right? He's blind all the way up to that point, and then he sees. Our problem is we're blind sometimes, and we refuse to be healed of our blindness. Like, and it's amazing. Sometimes we'd rather just stay blind.
Sometimes I think we need to retrench and go back to the very basics. When BJ was talking before, I was thinking about Ezekiel 13 and these false teachers that were trying to build this wall, and they were going to whitewash over it instead of actually fortifying it with plaster. And, you know, when we go out into the world and we're trying to do something for God, sometimes we'll get so task oriented. We convince ourselves, okay, my job is to knock on every door in town, or my job is to read the Bible all the way through in a year, or my job is to what, and we get specific about this, and we forget that what we're really trying to do is please God.
Right.
Ephesians 5 verse 10, right? Trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Everything gets washed through that filter, and sometimes the so-called works that we're doing in His service don't go there. The people who protest to the Lord on judgment in Matthew 7, 22, 23, did we not do this? Did we not do that? Well, look at all the stuff that we did, but you lost sight of why you were doing it in the first place, or you never knew in the first place. It's not about making sure you build a nice looking wall and get paid for it at the end of the day, and you're able to leave town before they realize how cheap you were or how lazy you were or whatever. It's about serving the Lord in everything that we do. And I think that if we can go back to that, whatever I'm doing, however long I've been doing it, 20 years, 50 years, whatever, if I can say, why am I showing up to the church house on Sunday? Why am I singing these songs? Why am I reading my Bible? Am I trying to do my deeds to be seen of men, like Jesus constantly warns his people about? Or am I actually trying to build a relationship with God? Am I really trying to serve my Lord, my Savior? Those two things don't intersect as often as we think they do. And it does us good, I think, sometimes to just back up and re-examine. This is what I've been reading. Like most sports fans, I love greatest of all time lists. Baseball, perhaps more than most sports, lends itself to comparing like to like throughout generations. Stat 1 by Craig Messmer claims to have found a new and mostly objective way of determining who the greatest players in history really were. Number 1 of all time, Babe Ruth. What a shock. The fact is, greatness is obvious in sports, especially at the highest level. But is that so in the Lord's church? Are there visible signs of greatness? And is it possible for so-called ordinary Christians to acquire them?
I'll jump
I'm
in.
into the thought
I'll start.
questions,
Yeah,
if you've
I'll
noticed.
start this one out. So I might be taking you a different direction than we want to go, Hal. So if I do, just get us back. I think where we need to underline this whole conversation is taking the focus off ourselves and putting it back where it belongs, on God and his strength and his grace. You know, one of the things that Paul, so in 1 Corinthians, Paul goes through and talks about, of course, the way that the body is structured by God's design, and that the parts that we would give lesser honor to are actually some of the most important. Paul's point is that we don't see it the way that God sees it or understand the value that people have. You know, God does great things through common people, not because of their abilities or their strength, but because of who God is and his strength. And it's when we give ourselves in faith and trusting ourselves in God that God can use us and do different things. And then what's interesting in 2 Corinthians, what he condemns the Corinthians for is commending themselves by themselves and comparing themselves to one another. So in 2 Corinthians 10, he says this regarding them. He says, let such a person understand that what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. Not that we dare classify or commend ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they're without understanding. And I think that is a very strong, powerful warning to us when we start measuring to each other to one another. And we do it with all sorts of things. We'll do it with preachers. We'll do it with any kind of work in the church. Especially if even within a local church, someone did a job for so long, and then that's the standard that we hold anyone who takes up that mantle going forward to. Are this good? And we're just without understanding if we are comparing ourselves to one another and thinking that somehow greatness is in who we are. The greatness is in God and his strength and his grace. And he can do great things through common people. He can do great things for very talented people. And this is not to, set aside other things that Jesus taught. There are 5 talent people. There are 3 talent people. There are 1 talent people. And God gives to each, a measure that he has designed. But all of it is not for our glory. It's for his purpose. He puts us where we need to be. And the 5 talent guy that thinks it's about him or that commends himself is not going to accomplish for God what the 1 talent guy can do that trusts in the grace and strength of God. So those were my thoughts. I don't know if that's the direction you wanted to go with this, but that's what I wanted to underline that question with is we are not great, and we should not be trying to, climb some kind of spiritual social ladder or whatever that might be. I don't know if that makes any sense. I see your wheels turning over there, Terry.
Well, I think similar to that, Jesus said the greatest among you are the ones who serve, right? And so if you just piece a couple things Jesus said together, like in Matthew 20, whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Whoever be great must be your servant. You go to the Sermon on the Mount. If you do good things, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. I mean, one of the things that Jesus condemns is this public promotion of being a servant, right? And if you put all that together, one of the things I think is really funny is in the church, we measure greatness based on what we can see, but true discipleship is serving other people to not be seen. I got to tell you that some of the greatest disciples I've ever met, sometimes they're people that if you didn't know any better because you took time to really get to know them, you would almost think that they weren't very faithful. Like I know stories of people, for example, who may not make it to every Wednesday night Bible class, and the elders ask what their problem is. And yet I know from talking to that person, the Wednesday night thing has to do with some personal issues. But I know story after story where that person is very active serving other people in ways that people that show up on Wednesday night are not doing at all. And we measure people's faith by whether or not they attend 100% of the time, and don't really consider that there's a lot of people who attend 100% of the time who have a lazy, dormant, good for nothing faith because they show up for church and they don't do anything else. And that sounds harsh, but we kind of need to be woke up a little bit by that. Like if the fullness of your Christianity is attendance, you're not very much Christian. Like, and that, I know that doesn't make sense grammatically, but you're not. You're failing.
Well, Terry,
I
Terry,
think that's the key.
Well, that's the question that people ask when someone asks, "Are they faithful?" What are they asking when
They're
people ask
asking
that
about
question?
their attendance. Yeah.
And that's ridiculous.
It's funny because I've had people, by the way, I can tell you stories. I won't call names, but I can tell you stories of people who are at every service. But one of the things they won't do is they won't open their home to anybody because their home was so nice and they worked all their hard life for it to get just the way they want. And they don't want anybody tearing it up. And at the same time, I've got people who struggle in their attendance, but you tell them, hey, we need to have a small group. Oh, come on over. We'll do it at our house. Now, tell me which one of those two is more faithful at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Which is more what we're supposed to be. And look, the other problem we have is we put such an emphasis on the public acts of worship. Like not even like who your best song leader is, but why do people not want to go to a big church a lot of times? Well, there's not a lot of work for me to do. Let me tell you, the reality is the bigger the church, the more work there is to do. Yeah, you may not get to lead singing as often, but that's not the real work of the church. Like, that's not it. Right. More people means more people that need to be encouraged, that need hugs, that need to be, told it's going to be okay, that need to be helped, that need financial aid, that need prayers, that need to be taught. That's the work. Like, that's the real stuff, and I just got to tell you, like when I read this question, that's what came to my mind was the visible signs of greatness usually aren't signs of greatness in the church. Like if you're measuring somebody's faith by what you can see, it's probably not a correct measurement. Mm-hmm. And the flip side of that, but guys, is the same too. Most of us in the church, the things we struggle with are also things you can't see.
That's right.
Right. So you may look at me great, but if you knew me like Brian, BJ, whatever you call him, I don't know, what do you go by officially now? I always know he's BJ. Yeah.
People call me whatever they want, but BJ
Brian-
is usually what I go by.
Brian James Sipe. BJ, like BJ said, you see me for who I am, but I know who I really am. And I know that deep inside, this is a very flawed, broken guy that's only here by the grace of God.
Yeah.
And just as the true greatness of your discipleship is not visible, neither is the true failure of your discipleship visible.
Mm-hmm.
The only person that really can measure statistically our discipleship is God. And all I got to say about that is I am so thankful that he gave us grace to bridge the gap of how so low I am from where I should be. And he did that because he knows how bad I am. That's why he did it.
I want to piggyback off that, Terry, because I think one of the most wonderful things and one of the most awful things for the church has been social media.
Yeah.
And you can talk to Kenny Embry and he will talk about all the positives and all the negatives, and he's thought it through with his profession and what he's done. But I want to speak to one of the negatives here. This is interesting when you look at, not to get super analytical and statistical here, you look at about 2011, 2012, there was suddenly an increase in anxiety, psychotic disorders, depression, and suicidal attempts in youth. Suddenly. Why?
Instagram.
It was because youth were comparing themselves to one another on social media, and the things that got popular were Instagram and Twitter.
And it was
And
all
there is
picture based, by the way.
It was a direct correlation. So what people started doing is they started comparing, and this is what people do. They'll compare themselves with what they can see in someone else's life, right? They'll what they can see, what's posted, what's visible. And so, wives will compare themselves to other wives and think, well, they can do all these things, and so I must be a failure. I must not be able to, I'm not a really good, wife because I can't, have, work out 8 times a day like they post on social media and then do all these other things. Or preachers will do the same, like, this guy posts, every day and does this, and he's very, open about what he's doing. And I don't do those things, so I must be a failure as an evangelist. And you're not seeing all of the real stuff that's going on in the background. You're just seeing the highlights. And again, that goes back to comparing ourselves with one another. You can't do that because we get the wrong picture of what's reality and what's really going on. And one of the best things I've done is just, like, I'm not on Instagram. My wife tags me and stuff, right? I'll jump on Instagram to watch football highlights and things on things I follow, but I never post anything. The things I follow, I'm not following other people. But the only thing I post on Facebook is either duck related or my podcast. And that's it. Like, you go through, that is the only thing I talk about on social media, because I was guilty of that. And it was so easy for me to compare myself to others and either judge myself wrongly, like better, or judge myself wrongly, not where I should be. And it goes hand in hand with what you were just talking about, Terry. And I think we have to do a much better job on training Christians on how to not get caught up with that, with social media, especially.
I forget who said it, but the quote was, never compare your behind the scenes with somebody's highlight reel.
Right.
And that's what social media, and listen, I'm tossing it to him because in the last 2 years with him living at home, he's dealt with that, because social media, you find out these people you went to school with are getting married and they're getting their degrees and all this, and you're at home working a construction job, and your comparison, you kind of think, Peyton, you can talk about that, how sometimes it's like, well, my life's a failure,
It's tough. I'm kind of where Brian's at. I'm currently taking a little hiatus with social media. The first one I deleted was Facebook, and I get on it often, And just with Facebook specifically, it was rough around 2020, and that's when around the time I deleted it, and it was just shocking to me to see how quickly a universal congregation can be divided on political standpoints, social standpoints, ethical,
Ethical.
both ethical and ethnical.
Yeah.
Not an English major.
But that's when I deleted Facebook. It was just disappointing for me to see. But with Instagram and with Snapchat, it's a lot more difficult than Facebook. Facebook, it was easy for me to delete because bam, done. I rarely even check it anyway. Instagram and Snapchat for my age group, that's the one that we're primarily on.
Yeah.
Instagram, kind of like what Brian's saying, like there's a lot of things on there that you just see, like a lot of my friends getting engaged. A lot of my friends that I grew up going to high school with are having families. One of my friends specifically, super smart dude, just got one of the head engineering jobs at one of a big corporate company, at the age of 23. So you're seeing all these people and all these different places and all these different aspects of your life. And, you, on the other hand, you're in your bed about to go to bed, at 9:30 at night on Instagram, seeing all these people, no matter if it's 2 days ago or 3 hours ago, but they're living their life and they're showing you what you want to see. And that's difficult to think about sometimes, because you can compare yourself being like, oh, wow, this dude has got a, 6-figure salary based engineering job, and I'm here working a CMT technician trying to raise a little bit of money to go back to college. You start comparing yourself, and it's difficult sometimes. But another thing lockdown showed for me is that that's okay. There's a reason that you are specifically in the stage of your life that you're in now. And there's a reason why other people are in the stages of their life now.
That's right.
We all go through different obstacles. We all go through different challenges. 1 Corinthians 10:13, one of my favorite verses growing up in high school, says, no temptations overtaking you that's not common to man. God is faithful, and he'll provide a way of escape to endure it. It's kind of got a double-edged sword for me, kind of, on the negative side. There's a lot of temptation that's going to happen your way. There's a lot of things that's going to happen to you personally, but also there's going to be a lot of people in different stages of their life that you're seeing progress in life and doing things that they've set out to do, and you're not doing that. You have to be patient. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm just saying, it's difficult. That's ultimately why I've deleted Snapchat and Instagram, just because, I've had Snapchat now without Snapchat for about 2.5 weeks. And I've just seen like a huge, an instant gradual change in my positivity and in my mood, because I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on Snapchat during my free time looking and see what, Jimmy's doing in Florida, or what Sarah is doing in New England and Boston,
Sure.
He's just on Twitter reading all the Titans and Tennessee Vols updates.
Yeah, I will
texting them to me constantly.
I will say I cannot, I can get rid of Instagram and Snapchat, but now you can get so much sport news from Twitter faster than you can get the ESPN app now.
Oh yeah.
So I do have Twitter. I can't live without Twitter.
There's a progression here I hope we're seeing. We started with the motivation from the beginning. Am I trying to please man, or am I trying to please God? Right. And then how I answer that question is going to determine whether or not I'm comparing myself with others, or whether or not I'm doing what Paul says in that context of 1 Corinthians 12. Because in 1 Corinthians 12, as he's trying to help us understand this picture of real greatness and God placing people where he wants them to, he says that we are to have the same care for one another. If one suffers, all suffer. If one is honored, all rejoice. This is why Paul would write elsewhere, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. When I'm in a me-centered place spiritually, and I don't even realize it, and so I'm comparing myself with others, I don't rejoice with those who are rejoicing. I weep when they're rejoicing because I want that, right?
Yep.
And I'm not loving them, like, because I wouldn't want someone to do that for me. Because when it is my turn and God puts me where he wants me to, and something good happens or a blessing happens, you know, what if someone else is jealous of me and that success and thinking, well, I deserved that more than they did? Like, this is not a competition. We are not in a competition in the kingdom of God.
Right.
And sadly, that is how many geographical areas and churches and Christians operate. It's like a competition.
But that's how Americans operate.
Yes,
Like
yes.
we compete in work, we compete in everything.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I talked about competition a little bit on Sunday because you're out of Galatians 6 Sunday. You know, Galatians 6, in other words, bear one another's burdens, restore other people. Oh, by the way, at the same time, you take care of yourself, but you put others ahead of yourself too. It's kind of another way of saying Philippians 2 or 1 Corinthians 12. I mean, all those passages talk about putting other people first. But as I said Sunday, I was like, you know, we go on the road to Walmart. We want to beat them to Walmart, and then we want to beat them out of Walmart. Like, we want to win every step of the way. You know, we're going to not let them over in front of us to turn into Walmart. We're not going to let them in front of us in the checkout line. We're not going to do anything to let somebody beat us. And something, if we're that way, as trivial as going to Walmart, then what are we like in things that really matter?
Yeah.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about where the question's coming from, because lots of times I ask these questions because I'm genuinely of two minds. And this is one of those situations. Part of me says just because you don't have the big problem in your life doesn't mean you've got everything worked out. And I think it was Terry that was touching on it before. There are undercurrents that we don't properly appreciate. And it may not necessarily be a bad thing. It may be an absence of good things. Lots of times I'll say that there are entire cemeteries absolutely chock full of people who don't have cancer. You know, it's not just a matter of avoiding the big problem. You have to emphasize the good things. And I think we've been touching on that kind of concept here. You don't always see at a glance. At the same time, I could also argue, and I suspect I could probably get some support from you guys on this. If we were to look at our respective congregations or poll the congregations or whatever, there are 5 people in this room who are going to help you go to heaven. You know, who are those 5 people? We would come up with the same names.
I would hope not.
Well, you and I wouldn't, but I mean the congregation.
No, I would hope not.
No, I hope not too, but I suspect that we probably would. There are people who, and it's not necessarily because they preach better than anybody else, or they quote scripture more often than anybody else, or they've baptized more people than anybody else. There are certain people who have a glow about them. They have an aura, a radiance, where they are walking with the Lord, and you can tell. And it's difficult to quantify. It's difficult to put your finger on it. We know people like this who have served the Lord, who impress us and inspire us, not necessarily because of the things that they did, the number of brownie points they accumulated, the number of trophies they won, but because they have the Spirit of Christ. And that's a remarkable kind of thing. And I wish we could find some way to bottle that and distribute that. It doesn't work that way. I've tried, and it doesn't work that way. But what a wonderful thing it could be if we could maybe back away from the idea, at least in part, of, as BJ has been saying, qualifying our brethren based on statistics and simply see who is walking with Jesus and who isn't. I suspect very strongly that very core principle of our service to God is tangible. It is noticeable. Everybody sees it. That's my hunch anyway.
Let me ask a blunt question. 3 preachers and a preacher's kid here. If a congregation only has 5 people that everybody would agree on that would help them get to heaven, let's just lay that out. Isn't that partially our fault?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's,
I mean, Ephesians 4 tells me and you, it's my job to equip every member here for the ministry and
right.
for the work and for encouraging. And I think how what you're saying is there are some people, their personality is just different. It's just, you know, that's something you can't teach. Okay.
Mhm.
You can't teach being an extrovert or whatever, you know, what we often call the it factor.
Mhm.
But as far as like the real faith and action part, I think one of the things that, and I can tell you is confessional here. Early on in my preaching, I didn't get that right. Early on in my preaching, I was probably more what we would call classic Church of Christ preaching, you know, where
Mhm.
you're trying to head off false doctrine and you're trying to preach. In fact, I had people tell me, I reminded them of the preachers, you know, from 30 years before me, the hellfire and brimstone guys. And I think there was a time I took that as a compliment. And there's a time for that, by the way. But I think my preaching failed to properly equip people to do the work of ministry.
Right.
And when you were talking, how all I could think of, man, if there's only 5 people here
I've failed.
that we see in that mold,
Mhm.
and everybody agrees on that 5, then I failed
Mhm.
in my work.
I'll jump in here, Terry, and say, so how I get what you're saying with the it factor. So I'll just put a name out there, you know, like for me, you know, Keith Stoneheart
Yeah.
is a guy like that for me. I think all of us know Keith. He's just different. I mean, and everybody who knows Keith,
He's different for a lot of reasons.
right? And he would, yes, but you know, if you pulled a bunch of people and had them put a top 5, I suspect he would be like a name that would be on a list like that, or someone like Andy Cantrell. There's guys that just, you know, stand out.
Right.
But here's the deal. Here's what happens. My prayer should be, man, thank God that we've got guys like this. I'm so
Sure.
glad they're on our team. But what happens so many times is I think I need to be like them to help other people. But that's not the case. God doesn't need me to be Keith. God doesn't need me to be Andy. God needs me to be BJ. God needs Terry to be Terry. And if we focus on that aspect and what we're supposed to be doing, that's going to lend itself to, you know, who knows, you know, I might end up becoming, without even intending to or knowing that's not my goal. I'm not trying to be an influential person to be an influential person. I want to bring people to Jesus. And when that's our motivation, you know, that's when and doing it for Christ. I'll say this, just kind of backpedaling a tiny bit. When we talk about like the whole competition thing, this is not a theoretical, if people do this. People do this. I want to give an example. I'm not going to say a name or location, anything like that. I have a good friend that was, and I hate this term, interviewing or trying out, you know, for a church. And that's not what happens. This is a partnership, you know, and
it's a hard thing to describe, but we got you.
Yeah, you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Yeah.
And in this process, it was a preacher parade. There were about 4 other guys that they had brought in one after another. And in this interview with my friend, they asked him the question, what sets you apart and makes you better than these other guys that we've brought in? He said, that's when I decided this interview's like done.
Yeah.
And because if that's the mentality of leadership, that's going to be a cancer for that work in that church, and was already a cancer, because the mentality of leadership is, you know, we're going to, you know, compare ourselves with one another, and we have a certain standard. And I don't want to be judgmental, but I think this unfortunately comes a lot of times from men that are put into shepherding that have been businessmen their whole life, that are still businessmen, and they try to run the church like a business.
That's a whole nother podcast. That's a whole nother year of podcast.
It is. But I've been told one time, like, hey, you had 3 or 4 baptisms this year. We really would have liked to have seen 5 or 6.
Let me tell you something, BJ. When I moved to Memphis, it was a preacher parade. Like, it's no secret. Everybody knows it. And I remember saying back then, and this is the mentality, and I hate, again, confessional. Even if I don't want to go there, I want to be the guy they choose.
Right? Because what's the communication if you're not?
Yeah.
Well, they're better, right?
Yeah.
And that's how we interpret it. But we're on the same team here. What we need to see is, my prayer should be, I want God to put be needed and most effectual. And whether that's in Podunk, Danville, Kentucky, or at Temple Terrace, or some, Memphis, Tennessee.
And that's why when I moved here, you and I talked about the process when I moved here, because you were getting ready to move. And one of the things I did is I would not talk to, I talked to a few places, but I wouldn't go try out. I wouldn't try out multiple places. I was going to talk to places. I was going to go, okay, I'm going to find the one place I'm willing to actually talk to. And if that doesn't work out, then I'm going to move on. But I was going to do it one place at a time. I wasn't going to do a church parade. And if I found out they were doing a preacher parade, I wasn't interested, because I knew what that would do to me.
Yeah.
Right? Because of what I'd done before. And you're right. We're not in competition at all. But that's tough. It's really tough not to give into that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and let me touch on the idea of personality before we go back. BJ was talking about this a little bit. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, be imitators of me as I imitate Christ. What aspects of Jesus are we imitating? Was Jesus an extrovert? Was Jesus funny? Was Jesus quick-witted? Was Jesus, we can go through all kinds of things that oftentimes we will use as measuring sticks, especially for preachers, but not just for preachers. This person is setting himself apart because he's a good communicator. The young people like him, or what. There's all these kind of artificial things that come up. Jesus is not described in those terms. Jesus doesn't look like the one who is relevant or timely or terse or wordy, or we don't know what Jesus is like.
I'll say this, he kind of is. He was a teacher that turned everything on their heads. He was a teacher that multitudes followed. There is some humor in there, but that's not what we're told to follow.
Yeah. It's impossible to imitate his personality because we don't know what his personality was.
His personality.
Right.
Here's the problem though, Hal, is that's not what people today are drawn to. Like, the people today, they're not drawn to the fact that you love other people the way Jesus did and put other people first. They're drawn to whether you know how to tell a joke in the pulpit. It's unfortunate.
Well, and look at the movement of how, like, guys who stand up in the pulpit dress. Like, they're like, even down to the way that you look. Like, a lot of these big churches and
either way, by the way,
they hire people who look the way they want. They've got the jeans, they've got the V-neck, they work out, they've got the weird pastor beard going on.
Hey,
you know what I mean?
Hey,
yeah. Hey, but
Peyton needs to work on that, by the way. Come on.
all of that goes back to what you're talking about, how we want to imitate people that we find successful because we are comparing ourselves with one another rather than looking at Jesus. What made Jesus great? Well, that goes back to how we started this conversation. The greatest of you will be the one who is the least of you, the servant of all. The King of Kings got down and washed the foot of a disciple that was going to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. The Philippians 2, consider one another as more important than yourself. Do not merely look after your own interests, but also the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. I think that text flies over our head so many times. Do you realize Jesus considered you more important than himself?
Yeah.
That's what we're supposed to emulate. And when that's my attitude, I'm not concerned about me. I'm not concerned about my glory or commending myself or comparing myself to others. I consider others more important than myself, and my only goal should be, hopefully, God, you put me where you need me. Let me do what I need to do. And my reward is what I get from you. It's not what I get from other people.
Yeah. No offense to any person present or not present, but if I am trying to make myself over into the image of BJ Sipe or Peyton Francis or Terry Francis, that by the very definition of it means I am not making myself over into the image of Christ. And that's what I need to be doing. That's what I need to be focusing on.
You're going to be like me. You're going to have to eat a couple sandwiches, Hal.
Yeah.
I'm working on it.
I'll share one last thing. When I went into ministry, my dad, when I told my dad this is what I wanted to do, and I was decided this is what I was going to do, he told me one thing, and I'll never forget it. And he said, you just promise me one thing, that your goal is not to be a household name. Your only goal is to be known by God. And I loved that. And I've always cherished that because, you think about like who we're going to get for a gospel meeting and, whatever, you might say someone's name and someone be like, well, I've never heard of them. And really what they're implying by that is, well, why could we not get these other guys? Could we not get someone who was really good?
Hammonds?
Yeah. Could we not get Hal Hammonds? Was he not available?
Yeah.
Where's Keith Stoneheart?
I'll tell you what, some of the most effectual workers who have changed me and moved me are guys that nobody knows. And that's because that's not their goal. That's not what they're after. They're just trying to do God's work in God's way where they're at.
You have been listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Thank you for your support. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe through your favorite podcast platform and or on YouTube. Comments, corrections, and suggestions are always welcome. Please feel free to follow me through Facebook, MeWe, Parler, or Instagram, or check out my webpage, www.halhammonds.com. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.